Daniel Harper here. Let me ask you something most Americans haven't even considered. What happens when the world's largest freshwater system becomes a geopolitical flashpoint? In recent weeks, tensions between Washington and Ottawa have escalated over one issue that almost never makes headlines. Water. Not oil. Not tariffs. Not defense. Water. The Great Lakes hold 21% of the world's surface freshwater. The American West is in a historic drought, and Canada just made it crystal clear. Its water is not for sale. Tonight we're breaking down what was actually said, what the Great Lakes agreements really allow, how a $6 trillion regional economy depends on water staying in the basin, and why this dispute is about far more than lakes and rivers. It's about sovereignty. Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe. Because when natural resources become strategic leverage, you need facts, not noise. Let's get into it. Trump wants Canada's water, not metaphorically, not as a negotiating tactic, literally. He told Prime Minister Justin Trudeau he wanted to revisit the sharing of lakes and rivers between the two nations. He called Canadian rivers a large faucet that could solve California's water crisis. He disinvited Canadian mayors from Great Lakes Day at the White House over diplomatic protocols. And Mark Carney just drew a red line. Water is not negotiable, not for sale, not subject to American demands. Canadian water belongs to Canada. Period. That statement was not delivered as a press release. It was delivered in Davos in front of the world's economic and political elite, as Carney outlined Canada's $1 trillion plan to become an energy superpower. A plan that includes massive investments in pipelines, electricity, transmission, mines, and artificial intelligence infrastructure, all of it requiring water from the Great Lakes, water that Trump thinks belongs to the United States. Today, we are showing you why Trump is demanding access to Great Lakes water. What the $6 trillion Great Lakes economy actually depends on, how Canada controls the resources on its side of the basin, and why that control terrifies Washington, and why Carney's refusal to negotiate on water is forcing the United States to confront a reality it has avoided for decades. Canada decides what happens to Canadian resources. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. The American West is running out of water. The Colorado River is drying up. Lake Mead and Lake Powell are at record low levels. California, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico are facing water restrictions that threaten agriculture, energy production, and urban growth. 40 million people depend on the Colorado River. It is failing. The crisis is not theoretical. It is measurable. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, is at 35% capacity. The Hoover Dam, which provides power to 1.3 million people, could stop generating electricity if water levels drop another 30 ft. They are dropping. Farmers in California's Central Valley are leaving fields because there is no irrigation water. Cities are implementing permanent water use restrictions. The Colorado River Compact, which allocates water among 7 states, is based on flow assumptions from the 1920s that no longer match reality. The river does not carry enough water to meet existing legal obligations. Trump's solution is not conservation, not desalination, not water recycling infrastructure. His solution is to take Canadian water. Trump sees the solution sitting across the northern border, the Great Lakes, 21% of the world's surface freshwater, 84% of North America's surface freshwater, 6 quadrillion gallons of water, and Canada controls half of it. Trump mentioned revisiting water-sharing agreements with Canada in calls with then Prime Minister Trudeau. The New York Times reported it. Trump called the Columbia River, which runs through British Columbia, a large faucet. He suggested turning Canadian rivers southward to solve Western water shortages, not as a proposal for negotiation, as a statement of American entitlement. The logic behind the demand is the same logic behind every Trump threat against Canada. America needs Trump Canadian sovereignty. If the United States needs water and Canada has water, then Canada should provide it. The fact that the water is in Canada, controlled by Canadian governments under Canadian law, is treated as an inconvenient technicality rather than a fundamental barrier. But water is not oil. Water is not lumber. Water is not even critical minerals. Water is existential. Every ecosystem depends on it. Every community depends on it. Agriculture, energy production, manufacturing. 40 million people in Canada and the United States drink Great Lakes water. If you start diverting it, you are not just affecting trade balances. You are determining who survives and who does not. Canada has known this for decades. That is why every water-sharing agreement between Canada and the United States is based on the principle that water stays in the basin where it originates. The Great Lakes Street Lawrence River Basin Water Resources Compact prohibits large-scale diversions. 8 American states and 2 Canadian provinces signed it. The rule is simple. Water from the Great Lakes stays in the Great Lakes Basin. Trump wants to ignore that rule. He wants Canadian water flowing south to American states that are not part of the Great Lakes Basin, and he wants Canada to agree to it as a condition of trade negotiations, or as compensation for American grievances about tariffs or dairy quotas or anything else Washington decides to add to the list. Carney's answer is no. Not up for discussion, not negotiable, no. To understand why, what the Great Lakes economy actually is. Carney's refusal matters. You need to understand what the Great Lakes economy actually is. This is not a symbolic regional partnership. This is $6 trillion in annual economic output. If the Great Lakes region were its own country, it would be the 3rd largest economy in the world, behind the United States, behind China, ahead of Germany, Japan, India. The region includes 8 American states: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and 2 Canadian provinces, Ontario and Quebec. 160 million people, 25.8 million jobs in the United States alone, $1.3 trillion in wages annually. On the American side, the Great Lakes support this economy through water. Drinking water for 40 million people, cooling water for power, plants generating electricity, process water for manufacturing, navigation for cargo ships moving 200 million tons of freight annually. The Ambassador Bridge alone connecting Detroit and Windsor sees 10,000 trucks per day carrying $500 million in daily trade. 25% of all United States-Canada bilateral trade crosses that bridge. More trade than the United States conducts with France, Germany, South Korea, or the United Kingdom combined. 78% of the goods American companies in the Great Lakes region import from Canada are intermediate goods, raw materials, parts, components, services used to produce other goods in the United States. The supply chains are integrated. A car part might be cast in Ontario, machined in Michigan, installed in an engine in Canada, shipped back to Michigan for final assembly. That process requires reliable, predictable cross-border movement. It also requires water, lots of water. Manufacturing uses water, steel production, chemical, plants, food processing, pharmaceuticals. Every industrial process that requires cooling, cleaning, or chemical reactions uses water from the Great Lakes. The Palisades nuclear generating station in Michigan is restarting after a 4-year shutdown. When it does, it will draw 98,000 gal per minute from Lake Michigan, 141 million gallons per day. That is one power plant. Scale that across the region. Coal plants, gas plants, nuclear plants, data centers, artificial intelligence infrastructure. All of it consuming water, and all of it depending on a shared understanding that the water stays in the basin. Here is what Trump does not seem to understand. Canada controls half the Great Lakes. Not half the water, half the lakes themselves. Lake Superior, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario. All of them straddle the border. Canada owns the northern half, and Canadian law governs what happens on the Canadian side. Ontario alone has access to more Great Lakes water than any single American state. The province controls shoreline on 4 of the 5 Great Lakes: Superior, Huron, Erie, Ontario. Every drop of water on the Canadian side is subject to Canadian federal and provincial jurisdiction. The United States cannot unilaterally take it, cannot divert it, cannot demand it. Trump can threaten tariffs, he can threaten to block bridges, he can threaten annexation. None of that changes the legal reality. Water on the Canadian side of the Great Lakes is Canadian water. Period. But legal jurisdiction is only part of the story. The bigger issue is infrastructure. Moving water is expensive, monumentally expensive. Building the canals, pipes, pumping stations required to divert Great Lakes water to the American Southwest would cost hundreds of billions of dollars. It would take decades to build, and it would require Canadian cooperation because much of the water Trump wants starts on the Canadian side. Canada is not cooperating. Carney made that explicit. Canada is an energy superpower. $1 trillion in fast-tracked investments, pipelines, electricity transmission, mines, data centers, all of it requiring water. Canadian water for Canadian projects, serving Canadian economic priorities. Carney outlined this plan at Davos, not at the bilateral summit with Trump, at Davos in front of European leaders, Chinese officials, global investors. The message was clear. Canada is investing in itself, using its own resources, building infrastructure that benefits Canada first. And if the United States wants access to Canadian water, Canadian energy, Canadian critical minerals, it can negotiate as an equal, or it can watch Canada build partnerships elsewhere. Carney's refusal to negotiate on water is not isolated. It is part of the same pattern visible in every decision Ottawa has made since Carney took office. Trump threatens tariffs. Canada signs a trade deal with China. Trump demands control of the Gordie Howe Bridge. Canada points out Michigan already owns half under a public agreement signed 13 years ago. Trump threatens aircraft decertification. Canada joins Europe's Security Action for Europe defense program and starts building submarines with France and Germany instead of buying American. Every Trump threat produces the same response. Canada builds an alternative that makes the American threat irrelevant. Water fits the same logic. Trump wants Canadian water diverted south. Canada invests $1 trillion in domestic energy and artificial intelligence infrastructure that consumes water in Canada for Canadian economic benefit. Trump demands water-sharing agreements be revisited. Canada reaffirms that water stays in the basin and that Canadian water is governed by Canadian law. The pattern is deliberate. Trump views Canadian resources, Canadian infrastructure, Canadian sovereignty as negotiable. Carney views them as foundational, not subject to American pressure, not traded for tariff relief or market access, controlled by Canada for Canadian purposes. And water is the perfect example of why that position matters. Because once you start diverting Great Lakes water out of the basin, you cannot stop. California needs water. So does Arizona. So does Nevada. So does New Mexico. If Canada agrees to divert water to one state, every western state will demand the same, and the precedent once set becomes permanent. Canada looked at that future and said no. The Great Lakes Street Lawrence River Basin Water Resources Compact stays in place. Water stays in the basin. Canadian water serves Canadian needs. If American states need water, they can invest in desalination, water recycling, conservation. They cannot have Canada's. Trump disinviting Canadian mayors from Great Lakes Day was not about diplomatic protocol. It was a message. if Canada does not cooperate on water, the United States will treat Canadian participation in Great Lakes governance as optional. For over a century, the United States and Canada have managed the Great Lakes together. The International Joint Commission was created in 1909 to handle exactly this kind of cooperation. Water levels, pollution, invasive species, navigation, all managed jointly because the lakes do not recognize borders. Trump is threatening to end that cooperation, not explicitly, but implicitly, by excluding Canadian officials from meetings, by suggesting water-sharing agreements need to be revisited, by treating Canadian water as an American entitlement rather than a Canadian resource. The danger is that this approach backfires. If the United States treats Great Lakes cooperation as conditional on Canadian compliance with American demands, Canada can do the same thing in reverse. Want data on algal blooms. That requires Canadian monitoring stations. Want invasive species control? That requires coordination with Ontario. Want shipping forecasts and ice flow data? That comes from Canadian meteorological agencies. The lakes are integrated. You cannot manage one side without cooperating with the other. Trump threatening that cooperation to pressure Canada on water is like threatening to stop sharing weather data because you are angry about tariffs. It hurts both sides. But it hurts the side making the threat more, because it proves that cooperation cannot be taken for granted. Canada is already preparing for that scenario. Carney's $1 trillion investment plan includes infrastructure that reduces dependence on American cooperation. Electricity transmission lines that connect Canadian provinces instead of relying on American grids. Pipelines that move Canadian oil to Canadian ports instead of American refineries. Mines that produce critical minerals for Canadian industries instead of exporting raw materials to American manufacturers. Water fits the same framework. If the United States is going to treat Great Lakes cooperation as leverage, Canada will invest in infrastructure that uses Canadian water for Canadian purposes and reduces the need for American cooperation. Here is what makes Trump's water demands particularly reckless. The Great Lakes economy is not a Canadian economy or an American economy. It is a basinal economy. $6 trillion in output depends on cooperation, on shared water management, on integrated supply chains, on trucks crossing the border 10,000 times per day. Threatening that cooperation over water does not strengthen American leverage, it weakens it. Because the Great Lakes states, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota need Canadian cooperation as much as Canada needs theirs. Michigan's governor, senators, business leaders all pushed back when Trump threatened to block the Gordie Howe Bridge. They will push back harder if Trump tries to weaponize water. Because Michigan's economy depends on Great Lakes, water managed cooperatively. So does Ohio's. So does every state in the basin. The governors of Great Lakes states know this. They signed the Water Compact. They agreed that water stays in the basin. They agreed because their economies depend on it. Manufacturing in Ohio needs water. Agriculture in Wisconsin needs water. Energy production in Illinois needs water. None of them can afford to see water levels drop because the federal government is diverting Canadian water to states that are not part of the basin. And none of them can afford to see Canadian cooperation end. Because if Canada stops sharing monitoring data, stops coordinating on invasive species control, stops participating in joint shipping forecasts, every Great Lakes state suffers. The lakes are integrated. You cannot manage pollution on the American side if Canadian municipalities are not doing the same. You cannot control algal blooms if you do not have data from Canadian monitoring stations. You cannot predict ice conditions for shipping if Canadian meteorologists are not sharing information. Trump is threatening to weaponize that cooperation, and the governors know it means economic suicide for their states. Carney understands this. That is why his refusal to negotiate on water is not confrontational. It is strategic. Canada is not threatening to cut off American access to Canadian water. Canada is stating that existing agreements stay in place. Water stays in the basin. Shared management continues. As long as the United States respects Canadian sovereignty over Canadian water. But if Trump keeps pushing, if he keeps treating Canadian resources as American entitlements, Canada has options. Options that do not require confrontation, just investment. Investment in infrastructure that uses Canadian water for Canadian benefit. Investment that makes American demands irrelevant because Canada no longer needs American cooperation to achieve Canadian goals. Carney's $1 trillion plan is not a response to Trump's water demands. It is a response to the entire pattern of American pressure, and water is central to it. Artificial intelligence data centers consume massive amounts of water for cooling. Carney is planning to build those data centers in Canada, using Canadian electricity cooled with Canadian water, serving Canadian and international clients, not dependent on American infrastructure or American permission.